Well, a very warm welcome to all of you here in person and those joining on Skype today. Welcome to the United Lodge of Theosophists in London for our latest quarterly seminar, which is on mindfulness, meditation and Raja Yoga. Just a few preliminary announcements. One is that in the extremely unlikely occurrence of a fire, or the fire alarm going off, the fire exit is down the stairs that you came up, out through the front door, and cross over the road to assemble by the railings that surround the gardens opposite. Hopefully that won't happen. Another request is, if you have a mobile phone, could you please either switch it off or keep it on silent during the seminar? And those joining on Skype, if you keep your microphones muted apart from when you need to speak, that would be appreciated as well. Thank you. So hopefully you all found on your chair 3 sheets which we'll go through. First of all, there's this single yellow sheet, and this is giving the brief overview of what's going to be happening today. So we're dividing the 4 talks into 2 categories or groups, and calling the first 2 preparing to meditate and the last 2 beginning the practice. So we should clarify that in today's seminar there isn't going to be any group meditation, there isn't going to be any guided meditation. What we are going to be doing is providing you with sufficient keys and principles to be able to successfully start practicing meditation by yourself. And ultimately, real success in meditation has to come through the individual practice and effort. Because in a group or following instructions on what to do step by step, as you do it, one might temporarily have a good feeling or a sense of emotional upliftment, but that's not the real thing. And in most cases that doesn't last. It's a temporary, brief thing. But we hope that the information that we provide today from ancient time-tested sources will provide you with things that you will find do work and do produce lasting beneficial results if you work them. Because obviously a certain amount of effort, self-discipline, regularity of practice is required with anything in order to have some success with it. So after these few introductory words, we'll start the first talk, which is titled Raja Yoga's Preliminary Training, and that will move on to the next talk, Who is Meditating and Why? Which are important questions we need to discover. Which part of our being is actually doing the meditating? And what is our motive or reason for wanting to meditate? Different people can have different reasons or motivations. And then we'll have the workshop groups, which will be explained just before we begin them. Just to say a few words about that now, it will involve sitting in a few groups of around 3 to 5 or up to 10 people each if we have a lot of people. And each group will have a facilitator who will try to find out from those in the group what they felt were the key points or the most important principles from the first 2 talks. So there will be discussion about that. The facilitator will assemble a compilation of those points from the people, and then your respective facilitators will present those from the platform in a type of moderated panel. And those on Skype, you don't need to feel left out, because you'll have your own facilitator who will help you and who will present your points as well on your behalf. This will all be explained and clarified near the time. And then after the facilitators present the points from the workshop groups, there will be direct question and answer with the speakers. So the first 2 speakers will be sat here, there'll be a moderator, and we'll take any questions from the audience about those talks and topics. And you'll notice the last page of this sheet, which is the seminar handout, is a blank page with space for you to take notes during the talks, write down any questions you might have, or write down thoughts or comments. If you need a pen and don't have one, just raise your hand now and someone will fetch you a pen from the back. Or if you need one at any point later, you can just ask about that. Then after that we have a break downstairs for around 20 minutes. There's water available, and you can also, if you need to, go outside during the break to get some food or fresh air. The refreshments will be in the downstairs library, and that door will be opened when we begin the break, so you'll see where to go and where to get the water. And then after the 20-minute break we have the second part, beginning the practice. So the first two talks will be providing the initial guidance that's necessary for the preparation stages of meditation, and then the second two will explain how to actually begin doing the practice, what you need to know in terms of the practical essence of it. So the third talk is Theosophical and Buddhist meditation, and we'll hear a bit about some of the three most popular forms of Buddhist meditation today. Samatha meditation, metta or metta bhavana, which is the loving kindness, compassion meditation, and vipassana, also known as mindfulness. We aren't necessarily promoting or endorsing these various practices, but we'll be commenting on them, and if there are aspects of them which need to be advised against or things that meditators should be cautious about, that will be mentioned in the talks. And if anyone has any concerns or questions about the practices, that can then be asked in the second panel. So after that third talk we go on to mindfulness, a modern term for an ancient practice, which is our last talk, and then the final two speakers will again be on the platform with a moderated panel, and we'll take further questions from the audience. And then about 5 minutes before the end we'll have a brief wrapping up and summary of the day's events, the main things that we've learnt, the main points that came to the fore in the talks, and we'll also let you know about our regular meetings here as well, because we have weekly meetings on Sundays and Wednesdays. So you also have the program that we mentioned, and this has quotes relating to each of the four talks in chronological order. Some of these quotes you may not hear in the talks, and you may hear quotes and references which aren't in the handout, but this should provide a fairly good overview, and we encourage you to take this away and reread these at your own leisure, including the helpful hints quotes at the back. And again, the back page is for taking your own notes. The third sheet of paper that you should have found on your seat is the Welcome to the United Lodge of Theosophists letter, which you can read later at your own convenience. And this briefly explains what the ULT is, why we're here, what we do and how we do it. So just to briefly clarify, the United Lodge of Theosophists is not the same as the Theosophical Society. They're two distinct groups, but essentially the aims are the same. In the United Lodge of Theosophists we focus particularly on Theosophy as it was originally presented by H.P. Blavatsky, whose photo is up here, and William Judge, whose photo is up there, who were co-founders of the modern Theosophical movement at the end of the 19th century. And our view is that the vast array of teachings and writings that they produced is more than sufficient to give us the guidance, help, and information we need to make progress and understanding in the spiritual life. And those who may be here for the first time, or who may be new, might be wondering what exactly is this theosophy that's being referred to. Well, it literally means divine wisdom, from the Greek word theosophia. And the basic idea of it is that there is one esoteric teaching or philosophy which underlies all the world's religions, and which is the primeval, archaic source and fountainhead of all the truth that can be found in the various religions, philosophies and sciences of the world. It's been called a parent doctrine, or the universal philosophy. And Theosophy, as presented by H.P. Blavatsky and William Judge, is the latest presentation or representation of this teaching. And in a sense, it provides the answer to every question, the solution to every problem. It's there, not necessarily always readily apparent and available, but the teachings and the literature are so vast that you can find that Theosophy is what it claims to be. That's for each person to test and verify for themselves. The book table with wide array of literature available will be open during the break and after the meeting. So, before we begin the first talk, we ought to answer the question of why. Why are we hosting this seminar on meditation? Why did we decide to dedicate a whole afternoon specifically to this topic? One reason is that it's a very popular subject, as we all know. Almost everyone seems to be referring to meditation nowadays. Everyone knows about it. Another is that, in spite of the popularity, a lot of people find meditation a source of frustration and disappointment. Many people, or most of you here, have probably attempted it at some time or another and ended up dissatisfied. Either nothing really happened, or you found it too difficult, or the mind was so undisciplined, going all over the place, that you just couldn't bring yourself to focus and concentrate properly. And also there are potential risks and dangers from unwise practices in meditation. There are some things that are very popular in the New Age movement today which aren't really beneficial. And we'll hear about some of those, and some of those are referred to in the helpful hints quotes as well, such as meditation on chakras, or breath suppression, or trying to awaken the third eye, things that we don't need to be doing now and which the majority of us aren't ready to do. What we're all looking for and hoping to get out of today, I think, is simply to be able to master the basics of meditation, being able to control the mind, keep the mind concentrated, keep the thoughts under control, and make at least some small degree of process that will help us gain mastery over our everyday life, which is our right. And we hold seminars on a quarterly basis at the Lodge, normally the end of every 3 months. So the last seminar at the end of March was on karma and reincarnation in the world's religions. The next seminar at the end of June will be on the Masters of Wisdom, or the Masters Mahatmas.
September?
Sorry, yes, the end of September. The Masters of Wisdom, who you'll probably hear references to in the talks today. The new summer program for July, August and September is now out, and you can find this on the table at the back and the tables downstairs, so help yourself to that. The seminars are designed to appeal both to newcomers, people who've never been here before, as well as to those who do come here on a regular basis. So both those who have experience and knowledge of the theosophical teachings and those who've never encountered any of this before. So we hope that we'll be able to present the talks and the workshop groups in a way that will keep everyone's attention and be helpful to everyone. And we hope to make it as interactive as possible. So please do make notes, please do participate and feel comfortable to speak up freely during the workshop groups. And we hope that the whole day will be helpful and beneficial to all of you. So we'll start now with the first talk, which is Raja Yoga's preliminary training. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, friends. I suppose the obvious question to begin with is, what is the nature of mind? Now, we can't reach a definitive answer within the limited time we have here today, obviously, but perhaps each of us can begin to maintain a focus and go on to experience the true nature of mind in our own time for ourselves. So neuroscience and psychology have not yet provided conclusive evidence, nor can they agree that there is such a thing as the mind, due to the fact that the majority within today's scientific community promulgate that mind is a product of matter, whereas on the contrary, the occult science clearly affirms that mind can and does exist without the physical brain, which merely receives its impressions. So in The Voice of the Silence, which is this little booklet here, translated by H.P. Blavatsky from the Book of the Golden Precepts, there are rules and ethics presented and two paths of spiritual attainment. One is pursued by those seeking hidden knowledge for their own personal gain and salvation, and the other is chosen by those whose aspirations are prompted by compassion for all and philanthropy. So just to say a little bit about the Book of the Golden Precepts, I will quote from the preface. The work from which I here translate forms part of the same series as that from which the stanzas of the Book of Jan were taken, on which the secret doctrine is based. Together with the great mystic work called Paramartha, which the legend of Nagarjuna tells us was delivered to the great Arhat of the Nagas or serpents, in truth a name given to the ancient initiates, the Book of the Golden Precepts claims the same origin. The original precepts are engraved on thin oblongs, copied very often on discs. These discs or plates are generally preserved on the altars of the temples attached to centers where the so-called contemplative or Mahayana or Yogacarya schools are established. And as to the nature of mind, the Voice of the Silence states, these instructions are for those ignorant of the dangers of the lower Idi. He who would hear the voice of Nada, the soundless sound, and comprehend it, he has to learn the nature of Dharana. Having become indifferent to objects of perception, the pupil must seek out the Raja of the senses, the thought producer, he who awakes illusion. The mind is the great slayer of the real. Let the disciple slay the slayer. For when to himself his form appears unreal, as do on waking all the forms he sees in dreams, when he has ceased to hear the many, he may discern the one, the inner sound which kills the outer. Then only, not till then, shall he forsake the region of Asat, the false, to come unto the realm of Sat, the true. So, also one more quote from Patanjali's Yoga Aphorisms, a book translated by William Q. Judge from an Indian Raga Yoga system practiced approximately 500 years before Christ. Patanjali states, again from the preface, page 11, in order to understand the system expounded in this book, it is also necessary to admit the existence of soul and the comparative unimportance of the body in which it dwells. For Patanjali holds that nature exists for the soul's sake alone, taking it for granted that the student believes in the existence of soul. Hence, he does not go into proof of that which in his day was admitted on every hand. And as he lays down that the real experiencer and knower is the soul and not the mind, it follows that the mind, designated either as internal organ or thinking principle, while higher and more subtle than the body, is yet only an instrument used by the soul in gaining experience, just in the same way as an astronomer uses his telescope for acquiring information respecting the heavens. But the mind is a most important factor in the pursuit of concentration, one indeed without which concentration cannot be obtained. And therefore we see in the first book that to this subject Patanjali devotes attention. He shows that the mind is, as he terms it, modified by any object or subject brought before it, or to which it is directed. This may be well illustrated by quoting a passage from the commentator, who says, "The internal organ is there, compared to water in respect of its readiness to adapt itself to the form of whatever mold it may enter." And for those of you who are paying attention, we mentioned the word dharana in the first reading from the quote in the Voice of the Silence, which is translated as concentration, or sometimes as attention. So any tradition that has been passed from east to west, whether it be a martial art or a system of yoga, always has its exoteric and its esoteric teachings. So the exoteric is there to give a general outline to the masses and serve as a reminder to the earnest aspirant. The esoteric teaching is there to divulge the hidden knowledge of the hidden laws of nature to those who have been trained, tried and tested, and therefore entrusted with this perennial wisdom. This code of initiation is pre-Buddhistic and is there to flush out anyone prone to exploit the occult sciences for selfish purposes. And this code of initiation still exists throughout the globe today. So, to continue the theme as to the dangers that Matthew was speaking about earlier, the contemporary forms of yoga, such as Hatha Yoga, Kundalini and Kriya Yoga, introduced and made popular in the West just a few decades ago by Sikh Guru and Paramahansa Yogananda, are all potentially dangerous and damaging to people's physical and mental health. Furthermore, what is generally advertised as Hatha Yoga to the man and woman in the street in the West today is not even real Hatha Yoga, but no more than a system of gymnastic stretching and postures very loosely based on Hatha Yoga. The general disregard in Hinduism for Hatha Yoga can be seen by the fact that it is not included in the Chatur Marga in the same way that Tantra is not held in high regard to be classed in Hinduism amongst the Shad Darshana, the 6 schools of Hindu philosophy. So, to quote briefly from another book by H.P. Blavatsky, Raja Yoga or Occultism, under the name of yoga, dangerous exercises are taught all over the world, and in the West, well-intentioned but credulous people are being exploited, and even when not exploited, are being instructed in practices ruinous to body and mind alike, in the name of India and Indian philosophy. Worse still, in the name of theosophy, esoteric progress is held out as a bait to those who are ignorant and who are kept ignorant of the instruction left behind by H.P. Blavatsky. So, to quote from Patanjali again in the preface, the yoga system is divided into 2 principal parts, Hatha and Raja Yoga. There are many minor divisions which can be brought under either of these heads. Hatha Yoga was promoted and practiced by Machendra Nath and Gorakshnath and their followers, and by many ascetics in India. This system deals principally with the physiological part of man, with a view to establish his health and train his will. The processes prescribed to arrive at this end are so difficult that only a few resolute souls go through all the stages of its practice, while many have failed and died in the attempt. It is therefore strongly denounced by all the philosophers. The most illustrious Sankaracharya has remarked in his treatise that the system of Hatha Yoga was intended for those whose worldly desires are not pacified or uprooted. He has strongly spoken elsewhere against this practice. On the other hand, Raja Yoga, the Raja Yogis try to control the mind itself by following the rules laid down by the greatest of adepts. Patanjali's rules compel the student not only to acquire a right knowledge of what is and what is not real, but also to practice all virtues, and while results in the way of psychic development are not so immediately seen, as in the case of the successful practitioner of Hatha Yoga, it is infinitely safer and is certainly spiritual, which Hatha Yoga is not. In Patanjali's aphorisms, there are some slight allusion to the practices of Hatha Yoga, such as postures, each of which is more difficult than those preceding, and the retention of breath, but he distinctly says that mortification and other practices are either for the purposes of extenuating certain mental afflictions or for the more easy attainment of concentration of mind. In Hatha Yoga practice, on the contrary, the result is psychic development at the delay or expense of spiritual nature. These last named practices and results may allure the Western student, but from our knowledge of inherent racial difficulties, there is not much fear that many will persist in them. So that last paragraph is alluding to some, if not all, Western bodies are perhaps not fitted for proper Hatha Yoga practices. So the majority who attempt meditation today often struggle to maintain, because the proper preliminary training has not yet been done, and most are not even made aware or taught that a preliminary training is required first before any transcendental state can be reached. So what is Raja Yoga's preliminary training? So in Patanjali's yoga aphorisms or Raja Yoga system, it's also known as Ashtanga Yoga, literally translated as eight-limbed or eightfold yoga. So listed in the aphorisms on page 29, book 2, aphorism 29 and page 29 of book 2, they're listed as follows. So one is yama, translated as forbearance. The second is niyama, translated as purification of both mind and body. The third is asana, translated as postures. The fourth, pranayama, suppression of breath. 5, pratyahara, restraint. 6, dharana, attention or concentration. Dhyana, contemplation. And the 8th, samadhi, which is meditation itself, the culmination of all of the above, the eightfold yoga. And sanyama is the culmination of dharana, dhyana and samadhi. So the first two disciplines of the eightfold path that we just read, yama and niyama, consist of the proper preliminary training for Raja Yoga system. So yama, which is translated as forbearance, which consists of not killing, not stealing, not desiring material gain, patience, and generally self-control. And niyama, purification of both mind and body, also continence, which is the holding back of bodily functions. So both of them together really are the self-control of the lower nature. In Theosophy we have a septenary division, and the mind principle is divided into two. So we have the higher manas and the lower manas. So those first two disciplines are really about carrying out exercise and control over the lower manas. So we are taught by those who truly know that to really practice Raja Yoga at the highest level possible and thus attain the highest and purest results, celibacy is an unequivocal requirement. But even so, one can begin to practice aspects of the Raja Yoga system and simple forms of meditation without strictly being celibate nor vegetarian. So, to conclude, I'll quote from The Secret Doctrine, Volume 2, Cosmogenesis, page 295, which is under the heading of the third eye and the races with the third eye, and the subheading Occult Physiology. So, the question is often asked, why should celibacy and chastity be a sine qua non rule and condition of regular chelaship, or the development of psychic and occult powers? The answer is contained in the commentary. Now, the commentary can be read on the previous page on 294, which I'm not going to read now. When we learn that the third eye was once a physiological organ, and that later on, owing to the gradual disappearance of spirituality and increase of materiality, spiritual nature being extinguished by the physical, it became an atrophied organ, as little understood now by physiologists as the spleen is. When we learn this, the connection will become clear. During human life, the greatest impediment in the way of spiritual development, and especially to the acquirement of yoga powers, is the activity of our physiological senses. Sexual action being closely connected by interaction with the spinal cord and the grey matter of the brain, it is useless to give any longer elucidation. Of course, the normal and abnormal state of the brain and the degree of active work in the medulla oblongata reacts powerfully on the pineal gland, for owing to the number of centers in that region, which controls by far the greater majority of the physiological actions of the animal economy, and also owing to the close and intimate neighborhood of the two, there must be exerted a very powerful inductive action by the medulla on the pineal gland. Now, all this is quite plain to the occultist, but is very vague in the sight of the general reader. So we'll conclude there, and now we'll have our next talk on who is meditating and why.
So, friends, in this second talk, we'll take over from our friend who gave some words of introduction on this preliminary training for meditation. And we'll start this talk by trying to adopt the Platonic approach of going from universals to particulars. And we'll start this by reminding ourselves, for those who are familiar with it, and for those who might not be familiar with theosophy, we'll establish the three fundamental propositions, which are really the basis on which all the rest of the philosophy of theosophy is based. Because this is really important. And then we'll go to the septenary constitution of man, which was alluded to, which might help understand a little bit better what man is made of and how the different principles work together, and then we'll see how that affects meditation in particular. So hopefully things will get a bit clearer. If not, don't worry, there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers after that. So the first fundamental, an omnipresent, eternal, limitless, unchanging principle, the one reality. And the Hindus call it Sat, or truth, or Parabrahm, which is both absolute being and non-being. So it encompasses all. It has no attribute, as that would mean limiting it, and it's not finite. It's the field of absolute consciousness. And this absolute periodically exhibits aspects of itself, with alternation of periods of activity and rest in a cyclic fashion. And this particular point, this cyclic this universality of this law of cycle, is actually the second proposition. In the manifested universe, which we experience, we can observe the duality of spirit and matter. But in reality, these two opposite poles are really but two aspects of the one reality. So that's really important to understand. Now, this leads us to the third fundamental, which states that essentially everything in the universe is conscious. There is an identity of all souls with a universal oversoul, which is an aspect of the absolute. And they're like, all these souls are like sparks of a central fire or rays of a central spiritual sun. And these sparks go through the cycle of evolution. They evolve instruments which allow consciousness to express itself. And these vehicles, which are needed for the expression or for the exploration of this consciousness, so that's why spirit needs matter. These vehicles are gradually more and more complex, and they allow the acquirement of individuality. And for that, the spark has to go through the different kingdoms and gradually evolve instruments that allow the complexity to experience a greater individualization and a greater, more subtler form of consciousness, until gradually that spark reaches the stage of man, where self-consciousness is awakened and the mind principle is enlightened. And at that stage, before that, the evolution of that spark or the monad in Platonic and Greek philosophy. Until the stage of man, this evolution happens based on a natural impulse, so a kind of instinctual natural impulse. But from the stage of man onwards, because man has self-consciousness, there is then a sense of responsibility, and the efforts of that spark become self-induced and self-devised, it is said, which means that the spark becomes responsible for its own evolution and for its own pilgrimage back to the source. So essentially that's the three fundamentals in a nutshell. It's a lot to take on, but if you have any questions, you can ask them later in the allotted time for that. But let's now have a closer look at man and what really is man. So Theosophy teaches that man is a septenary being with 7 principles, and these principles allow him to interact and act on the different planes of nature. So there is a correspondence between the principles of man and the principles, the planes of nature. There is a correspondence. And in the same way that our physical body allows us to act and interact with the physical world, each of these principles, subtler and subtler, allow you and us to act on these corresponding planes, subtler planes. And so, although we might see them as separate principles, they really are all aspects of the one self. And that's also an important idea to bear in mind. Each principle is really the vehicle or instrument of the higher one, which needs to express itself through these lower instruments. So we can distinguish out of the 7 the 3 higher principles which form the permanent man. And we'll start from the higher. Atma, which is the higher self. It is the one self of all, or the universal spiritual sun. Then the 6th principle, if you start from 7 at the top, is Buddhi, which is the spiritual soul, spiritual intuition, direct cognition, and is part of the universal oversoul. And then you have the 5th principle, which is manas, or mind, the thinking principle, the human soul. And these 3, Atma, Buddhi and Manas, this triad forms the permanent reincarnating ego, or individuality, which is immortal. And then we move on to the lower 4 principles, which are transitory, so they change from life to life. And they're composed of, so the 4th one is the Kama principle, which is the animal soul, the seats of passions and desires. Then you've got the 3rd, which is Prana, or the life principle, which brings coherent energy. Then you've got the 2nd, which is Linga Sharira, or the astral body. And that is the electromagnetic template on which the 1st principle, which is the physical body, is built. And that astral body is the real seat of the senses. And with this 4, that completes the lower quaternary. And it's, again, we'll say it again, but it's important to realize that these principles are not like the peels of an onion, like the different layers. They're actually, they form one whole, which is man, which is what we are. So it's just for sort of to be able to understand how we work, that we sort of subdivide them, but not really separate. But let's get back to our question now, which is, what is meditation and who meditates? Madame Blavatsky defines yoga or meditation as a means of attaining spiritual liberation. She says, psycho-spiritual powers are obtained, an induced ecstatic state leads to the clear and correct perception of the eternal truths in both the visible and the invisible universe. And William Judge expresses it in a slightly different way. He says, real concentration, or yoga, is in fact union with the divine within. We are to understand that we are each the divine. There is no separateness, but one spirit is in each, reflected in each person. Thou art that spirit. And he goes on to say that the true source of concentration is selflessness. For as long as we feel the shackles of the personal self, so long is concentration hindered in various ways. We'll go a little bit about, a bit deeper in that a bit further. In other words, meditation is a self-realization. A realization of the self with a capital S, which is Atma, so that's 7th principle, which really isn't really a principle, but the spirit within. And William Judge expresses this alchemical transcendence beautifully in this way. He says, when a firm position is assumed with the end in view of reaching union with spirit through concentration, Ishvara, or the spirit or Lord within, comes to the aid of the lower self and raises it gradually to the higher planes. And the Bhagavad Gita expresses this idea of raising the lower self by the higher self. So what do we mean by the lower self? Well, the lower self is really the personality and the personal man, so which is essentially the lower 4 principles, together with the lower mind. And that's an important part. It was touched in the first talk, that the mind, or manas principle, is actually dual. And it has a lower aspect, which is the mind, that part of the mind which deals with our lower desires, our material life. And it's also got a higher aspect of the mind, which allows it to be in touch with its higher principles and its higher nature. It's that part of the mind which is more in touch with the universal aspirations, with the Plato's idea of beauty, love, compassion, all these higher ideas. So, and this idea of the duality of the mind is really key to meditation, because if we are to try and train the mind, we need to understand this dual nature and understand why the mind tends to naturally turn itself towards the outer, and if we try and turn the mind inwards and upwards towards the divine spark in us, then we have to understand that the rest of the time in our everyday life, our mind is turned outwardly and interacts with the senses, and this is what allows us. This is important because it allows us to interact with the outer world, with other people, and this is really important. But when it comes to meditation, it becomes an obstacle, because we are trying to turn inwards, not outwards, and the senses turn us outwardly. So that's an important point. And this is what Plato called the ardent turning of the soul to the divine. So we've mentioned that duality of the mind, and we'll now touch quickly on what was mentioned earlier about Patanjali's system, which is exposed in the Yoga Sutras. He emphasizes the importance of this preliminary training, which was spoken of in the first talk. The essential aspect of this preliminary training, because, as we said, the senses and our personal desires call our attention towards the outside and towards the more material, personal aspect of life. And this is why it's important, if we want to be able to turn inwards and upwards, to restrain gradually our senses, our sensual nature, and make our personal self make it subservient to our higher nature, to our divine nature. So it's not suppressing it, or it's not trying to ignore it. It's trying to realize that the lower nature and the lower self is important, but it has to be subservient to the higher, the more divine nature in us. And so it's easy to understand, because if you've ever tried to meditate or even focus on an idea, and if at that particular time of your life you're going through a period of strong emotions, be it sadness or doubt, fear, anger, all these belong to the lower self. It is next to impossible for the mind to focus on what you wanted to focus, because of these preoccupations. They will distract your mind away from what you're trying to focus on. So that's why it's important to recognize the lower self, and to gradually, for the rest of the day, not just the time you're meditating, but the rest of the day, try and not give too much importance and not encourage too much this sensual nature, and cultivating also the virtues, because the virtues are linked to the spiritual nature, and will also help in a virtuous circle. And ultimately, this exercise of meditation corresponds to a realization of the unity of life, a realization of the self, of the spirit, of the oneness of life. So practically, understanding our own nature and learning to know ourselves will lead us to understand the illusion of separateness. That's this idea that you, him, me are separate is actually an illusion. And it is encouraged by the senses in a way, but with this process of meditation, we gradually put the senses back where they belong and allow this inner life to flourish. We'll have a different perspective on life and will be less imprisoned by the senses and that the perception of the senses, and more allowed to feel the oneness of all. And this is important, and this actually comes with some benefits, because seeing the unity and transcending all these difficulties of the lower self, like anger, doubts, and fear, and suffering, will make it easier for us to help ourselves and also help others around us. So we'll finish this talk with a small quote from Madame Blavatsky on this topic. She wrote, "The ever unknowable and incognizable, the causeless cause of all causes, should have its shrine and altar on the holy and ever untrodden ground of our heart, invisible, intangible, unmentioned, save through the still small voice of our spiritual consciousness. Those who worship before it ought to do so in the silence and the sanctified solitude of their souls, making their spirit the sole mediator between them and the universal spirit, their good actions the only priests, and their sinful intentions the only sacrificial victims." So friends, that brings us to the end of this second talk.
Can you hear us on
Can't
Skype?
hear.
Okay, so we're reconvening.
Okay, so would those from the Skype group, the facilitator, like to give us a few, 2 or 3 main ideas?
Yes, I think take this up. So,
We can't hear you. You're
Can't hear
breaking
you.
up.
You hear us now?
That's a bit better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Slowly.
Can you speak slowly, because a friend is taking a few notes?
Okay. We speak Lola on Skype. And Edward had a comment. The practical pati and the theoretical parijati are 2 distinct methods. I would like the panel to emphasize the distinction between these 2. In other words, the preliminary stages of yoga and the samyama.
Okay, thank you. That's a
They are
question.
distinct but unified. That's from Edward to begin with.
Okay.
Shall I read Lola's points now or wait?
No, we'll first take the main points and then take up the questions at the last part of the panel.
Okay, the other point then was Lola wanted to quote the second aphorism from Patanjali, which is from book 1, which is concentration or yoga is the hindering of the modifications of the thinking principle. And she would like us to elaborate on that.
Thank you. That's another second question. Fine.
and pass you over to Sam.
Question is on this one, book 1, horizontal.
A point was made that there is a great difference between the concept of meditation in popular culture and the theosophical idea of meditation, which seems to come in a threefold. Short's causing that. Seems to occur in a threefold process, which is dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. And it was said that the hindering of the modifications of the mind, of the thinking principle, was the actual purpose, and the means of reaching it was the raising of the lower by the higher. That was a second point that was made. And also there was a book recommendation which was by an Indian scientist called Thai Mini, called The Science of Yoga, which is apparently speaks to meditation quite succinctly. There's also the argument. Can you hear us?
Yes, Thai Mini, but after that you said something.
Yeah, they were recommending a book by an Indian scientist and theosophist.
Yes, Thai Mini.
Science of Yoga. And the basic point is that Chitta and Purusha, which is consciousness and mind or soul, the idea is to try and unify the two.
Okay, thank you. So, thank you very much. So we'll take up the questions after the roundup of the facilitators. So now we'll ask Jeff if you'd like to give the main ideas of your group. Do you want me to write?
Yes. Seeing limits, the limits that we encounter in living, seeing these limits as spiritual opportunities for strength in the journey to Atma. So it's seeing limits, seeing the limits that and the limitations we encounter can be spiritual opportunities to derive strength in the journey to Atma. The next point deals with an observation in life that there is a great thirst, an extreme thirst that is going on, in that it's perceived that there is a great need for stillness to deal with this thirst, and that meditation can provide some form of shelter for this. Then it was observed that the experience of the kind of lower quaternary is something that produces massive overstimulation, and that the turning inward via meditation can help in dealing with the distraught consequences of living in externality and overstimulation. And that this can provide a step-by-step approach to some solutions requiring discipline, and that discipline can be joyful. Another point can be made is that regular practice of meditation exercises is very important, combined with a hope and a belief in our ability to make progress. Sorry, a couple more if I may. The thing was that in doing this, it is very important to create space and time and create a routine. And lastly, that often what comes from that is insights, and that the sharing of these fruits of insight from meditation with others can provide a strong ethical function, an ethical basis for living, and expose us to beauty. And I think the key point was made that Plato said the experience of beauty opens the soul to a harmony and is an auxiliary to meditation.
So, are you ready for the? Oh, you were the ones.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So would you
Yeah,
like?
so there were many points already.
Okay.
So we recognized what was said, that the Absolute has no attributes and that it only exhibits certain aspects of itself to the finite minds. And that is
Yeah,
like
just one.
timeless. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, just 1 second, so you can write.
Just
Fun?
what am I writing? Absolute.
Yeah.
Absolute has no attributes.
Yes.
And it exhibits certain aspects of itself.
That's a key point in the fundamental proposition. Yeah.
And that is done in cycles.
Okay.
And as soon as the noumenal goes into the phenomenal, we have duality.
Noumenal into phenomenal, then we have duality.
Yeah.
Well, spell that
Two
one.
aspects of the
Noumenal.
Noumenal
Yes.
into phenomenal, pheno, phenomenal. That spells duality. Phenomenal.
Just spells?
A-L.
Just spells?
No, it gives duality, right?
Yeah, it is as soon as it goes into
Into
the
phenomenal
world, you have
world.
spirit and matter.
Then we have duality.
Sorry, it's very hard to
Yeah.
to the board.
Exactly.
Interesting.
But we said the duality was aspects of the one reality. So that
Yeah, so that is explained by duality. So is our mind, and we recognize the mind as our tool because it is split.
Yeah, and the mind is the tool which reflects this
to
duality.
reach back to where we came from.
Yeah. To reach back where we came from.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And,
That's an
yeah,
important
but
point.
yes, and one member said in meditation we like to tune our lower mind with the universal mind. And that
Sorry, I missed
she
that.
Lower mind to be tuned to the higher.
and that there was an extreme awareness of also of the body sensations,
Yes.
of the emotions, of the feelings.
We become more aware of all the sensations.
Yeah. Which are
More aware of all sensations. Thank you. Any? Would you like to add something?
Okay, in our group we agree that meditation was an important aspect, actually a very key aspect in gaining in going to the core of our essence.
Core of our essence, going into the core of essence.
And so it was also agreed that there was an initial preparation that is needed, or training that is needed in order to cultivate true meditation, in order to avoid, how we call it, avoid
Overcome
what we call developing the lower cities.
Yes. So the highest spiritual, level needed to avoid dangers of the lower cities.
That's it. And,
The pitfalls. Pitfalls of the lower psychic powers. Could that be?
We also agree that from what Patanjali says on page 28 about the instruction that for that preparation. We agree that on page 28 of Patanjali, where he says, forbearance, veracity, all those are steps that help us develop that mental and physical discipline that is needed for cultivating meditation.
So it's book 1, verse 29 would be the proper preparation. And that, would you like me to read that?
Yes, please.
Or would you like to read it?
Okay, I have it here. So on page 29 it says, the practices which are conducive to concentration or 8 in numbers, forbearance, religious observances, posture, suppression of the breath, restraint, attention, contemplation and meditation. And then it explains further those different components. On top, for the second talk, we asked ourselves which part of our being was meditating, and we agreed that it must be the thinking principle, or the lower principle, which is meditating in order to gain insight and wisdom of the higher and permanent self. And that the purpose for this was to gain universal truth, to develop universal spiritual perception, to gain the idea of universal beauty, universal love, universal unity. And those are the things.
Yes, so it's really aiming very high for universal perception. So what we'll do is, as we're running late, we'll take up questions that were pending from the panels, the Skype panel.
Can we use 2 questions already which came up?
Yes, we can
Now?
take them now at the panel, so long as they're part of the first group.
Yeah.
So can we just have Jeff, or who would be all the facilitators? We have
I think that are
speakers.
speakers. Okay, so we'll have the speakers with the. And I'm the moderator, yeah. So we'll take up the questions. First, maybe the ones on Skype, which were pending, which were already expressed. And, yeah.
So should we start with the ones on Skype, yeah?
Yes.
So,
Do you want me to pull these up? So you can see
no, it's fine.
further?
Yeah. The first, there was one question that was, 2 questions from Skype.
Yes, so concentration or yoga is the hindering of the modifications of the thinking principle.
Yeah, but there was a
And
system.
also,
Yeah.
so the question also was, what's the difference between dharana, dhyana, and samadhi?
Yeah, that's the.
So,
Okay, so that's the question. What's the difference between dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, which are the 3 aspects of Pratyahara, which are described in Patanjali.
Yes. Well, dharana, meaning concentration.
Yes.
I wouldn't be sure how to translate.
Can you hear us? Yeah.
The other two.
Pardon?
So how would you
Okay,
translate
maybe.
the other two terms?
That is here.
So, okay. So the fixing of the mind on a plane or subject is the attention, so dharana. The continuance of this attention is contemplation, dhyana. And this contemplation, when it is practiced only in respect to a material subject or object of sense, is meditation itself, so samadhi.
So
Does
there,
that
Like
answer
to,
the
uh,
question?
so there are just three aspects of the process called samyama, which is really the
Where does
meditation.
this quotation come from?
So
It's
that's
Patanjali.
from Patanjali. So these are the three. Essentially, these are the three aspects of meditation that are present in book 3 and 4, and that has to come after the preliminary training of pratyahara has been achieved, which is the preparation, which was spoken of, and which is exposed in books 1 and 2. And that preliminary training is what was spoken of, particularly in the first talk, which is sort of the forbearance. So all these, actually, you've got them here. It's probably a good idea to remind.
And which have been
Yes.
copied on the board. Here, the forbearance.
So, not killing, veracity, not stealing, continence, and not coveting, which are the universal great duties. And the religious observances are purification of both mind and body, contentment, austerity, inaudible mutterings, chanting and mantras, and persevering devotion to the Supreme Soul. And restraint is the accommodation of the senses to the nature of the mind, with an absence on the part of the senses of their sensibility to direct impression from objects. So
Thank you.
isolation, we could say.
Yes. Maybe we could just come back to one idea: is what is contemplation and what is like dhyana and samadhi?
Yeah.
Because we've spoken of dhyana.
Okay, let's go back to this idea. So these come after the preliminary training, and essentially these three, attention, contemplation, and meditation, are three into one. But it starts with attention, which is trying to focus the mind on one object. Contemplation is this exercise, but practiced over a certain period of time. So the idea of focusing the attention over a certain amount of time, that's the contemplation. And I guess meditation is taking it further and putting it all together, and then becomes what you call meditation, really. So these are a few ideas, hopefully, that can clarify that.
And by focusing on the highest, which would be, for instance, Ishvara, or the higher self, then this meditation would be first with the seed, but then it becomes meditation as union or yoga or complete communion with the higher self and a transformation. But we'll take up a question that was...
Yeah, one question was asked, how do the Greek philosophers relate to the Hindu system, especially Plato?
Okay, how do the Hindu philosophers relate to the... how do the Greek philosophers, relate to the Hindu system?
Yeah, relate to the Hindu system.
Hindu system.
Yeah, it was mentioned.
Especially Plato.
Yeah, it was mentioned a few aspects of the Greek philosophy. Mentions both the going from the universals to the particulars, which was sort of a Platonic approach, and also the Plato's expression for how Plato expressed this idea of meditation. I think it's the ardent turning of the soul to the divine, so the question was how is that related to Hindu philosophy? Can Greek philosophy be linked? And Theosophy answers it's all parts. They're all branches of the one trunk. So it's not surprising to there is one underlying universal truth, and really they also influence each other, and it's really not surprising, and it's coherent. It's all it all makes sense, but it's the same idea. The Pythagoras and Plato were initiates, and they had knowledge of the esoteric philosophy. They were initiated into the mystery schools, who were essentially teaching the same ideas, the same truths as were found in Hinduism. So it's not surprising at all, and Theosophy and the big part of the work of Madame Blavatsky, particularly in The Secret Doctrine, was to actually show how it is all connected. And
If I can add to that quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the Brahmacharya discipline, where I understand it, doesn't try to learn anything. He simply, well, I say simply, but the idea behind the discipline is to try and remember through concentration and other techniques. And I think that correlates also with Plato's idea of anamnesis.
Recollection.
Yeah, anamnesis and reminiscence. So, where we get the axiom in the West for all learning is remembering. So,
Yeah,
I think there's a correlation there.
Yeah, and it was spoken of reminiscence, and in the books, it's the difference between memory and reminiscence are given as something that belongs to the memory of the soul, as different from the phenomenal memory which we store as we live, and the true memory with the innate ideas and these ideas of beauty, justice, etc., which were imprinted into our higher minds, our souls, into our permanent nature at the beginning of humanity. So these are things that are also related through the legends we hear of these gods that were among men. Another question?
Yeah, I have another
Last
question.
one?
Yeah, because it was said that the 8 steps of Patanjali to get to the higher self, and one was said suppression of breath.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something which is very much
we did
warned
read
against.
We did read
Yes.
in the introduction, though, in the preface,
Yeah.
that this, although it's Hatha Yoga, it's not recommended, but he would recommend it for. What quote is it? Yes, advises that postures 3 and 4. So William Q. Judge advises postures 3 and 4. Physical breath suppression are not necessary nor recommended for Western.
That's
You
an
have to make
important-
that sure, because that is one part of Hatha
Yes.
Yoga which is very much warned against.
Okay, so we'll need to stop for the break. You wanted a question?
Yes.
Okay, go.
At this time. The second talk was who is meditating and why, which raises the question, what is the best motivation for wanting to meditate, and can there be bad motives for wanting to meditate?
So, did we all hear the question? What are the motives to start meditating?
What's the best motive?
What's the best motive? We'll take up these points certainly in the second part of the seminar, but maybe you can give a quick answer.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, because depending on the motive, if the motive is selfish, then you sort of which might be, for example, just a personal growth, individual growth, which then might lead further down the line to sort of increased selfishness.
Prakshita Buddha.
That's right. That's the term Pratyeka Buddha, or Buddha of selfishness, which is opposed to sort of the altruistic. If the motive behind meditation is to try and realize the unity of all, and try and then benefit the whole through and share our understanding and help others, then that motive is more selfless and might then lead further down the line to the Bodhisattva ideal, or the Buddhas of compassion. So although it's a lot further down the line, it all has seeds which can be sown right now. So it's important actually to understand our motives and think about that.
And maybe to just conclude this part of the panel before the break, we can read a quotation from The Secret Doctrine, which speaks of dhyana, or this word which is a term used for esoteric schools. HPB uses this term to say that it's something that connects, whether schools from the east or the west, whatever, to have this connecting line. And she says, in the old books, the word jnana, or dhyan, is defined as to reform one's self by meditation and knowledge, a second inner birth. Hence, dhyan, or dhyan phonetically, the book of dhyan. And we'll take that maybe as a start to the second part of our seminar. So this talk is on theosophical and Buddhist meditation, shamatha, metta, vipassana, and so this will deal with these different approaches, which are just by way of example as we go along, and then speak of the theosophical approach. We had the first two talks in the first part of before the panel, which dealt with the theosophical approach of meditation as not as something that is a sectarian approach or a particular school, but as what is called Raja Yoga, that is something that really is transcendental and which aims the highest. So we'll talk about the theosophical part, towards the end, after speaking of the most popular Buddhist approaches. But before we go into that, we'll just take a little read from an article on Buddhist meditation, which is published in one of our magazines called The Theosophical Movement. And it says, Buddhist meditation, scientifically pursued, produces a progressive psychical transmutation which profoundly modifies the character and develops intelligence. The detachment and serenity experienced during hours of meditation penetrates the whole life, leads to selflessness, and permits one to look upon one's life impersonally. So this was an aspect that is directly related to what we just read as something that transforms oneself. It's meditation is a means to reach to our inner nature, and that really results in a transformation or a profound transmutation of our inner self, because we tap into our nature, our higher nature, which is essentially spiritual. And the Buddhist meditation, which we'll speak about, is as a general term, it contains plenty of different schools, approaches, and we will not deal in or try to be judgmental or say this is good and this is not good, because as a philosophical approach, Buddhism is lived in general, more like a way of life, common sense in life, and as a philosophy of life, unsectarian. And so we will deal with the philosophical approach more than what goes on in different schools, because that, of course, is influenced by probably the people who head those different centers, and that may result in a certain way, maybe very dogmatic or less dogmatic or whatnot. But that depends on each individual's personality and way of looking at the rules and using them. So this is a general overview that we wanted to give. And it is also said in the same article, so Buddhist meditations are divided into two major categories. And the idea is that meditation practices in Buddhism which aim at cultivating mindfulness or awareness, as also cultivating positive emotions and acknowledging and eradicating negative emotions. So these are the aims. And Buddhist meditations are divided into, let's say, overall, two categories. One is the samatha and the vipassana. And the samatha meditation refers to any meditation practice which aims at developing a higher state of consciousness by cultivating mental integration, which manifests as concentration or calmness, that is shama, and that means calmness of the mind. And vipassana refers to meditation practices that aims at gaining insight. Pasya is the sight, and vipassana is the gaining insight into the realm of things. So it's mindfulness of breathing, and this goes with what is called metta bhavana. Metta being, the Pali term for Maitri, which means friendship. That is cultivating positive emotions. So these three are very often inseparable. In fact, even if the schools are called this or that by this name or that name, the practices usually are influenced or overlap one school or the other. So these practices, mindfulness of breathing and metta bhavana meditation, are both samatha practices and prepare the mind for vipassana by establishing concentration and emotional positivity. So this was just by way of introduction and a quick overview of these aspects. So we said that the first school, and it's quite, you have a lot of literature. As soon as you look into these topics, you have different books, different schools, but basically shama means to just pacify the mind, and we have heard earlier that the mind is always rattled by this, that and the other, and identifies to whatever comes outside, and also by our external senses, our emotions, and what goes on in the world, and the communications from the outside. So the basic step is to just stop this, try to pacify the mind, and the memory aspect and all the other obstacles we will just speak about by stepping back. So that is the first, one would say, the first idea behind. It is stepping back, just let go of what is outside, and then think of the obstacles that is inside. And normally one of the schools speak of raising awareness of our breath. And when we think of what was said earlier about in the second fundamental propositions of what the cycles and the breath means of outgoing and in-breathing and out-breathing, this is something that concerns the vitality, and that is particularly important. So it is not practicing the pranayama or stopping the breath or anything. This is the first step will be to just concentrate on the breath and become aware that there's something that goes and comes in, and that our body is constantly interacting with the outside. And then it also is a way of understanding that there's something that we use because the vitality is something that penetrates our whole body. And by doing this, a certain calmness is brought into our system, because we become aware that there's something more to just our paying attention to the outside. And then there's the spiritual aspect of prana, which comes into awakening in this process, because man, and especially from that point of view, we'll see in the later part of this talk that understanding what the constitution of man is will give a spiritual tinge to everything. So we won't concentrate on just the breathing, but it'll become breathing as part of this vital aspect of our nature, the prana. And then it's also said that there are obstacles, obviously, when one does that. It was spoken of the mind that is that hops from one flower to the other, like a butterfly that goes from one idea to another. Or it's also spoken of the monkey mind. This is a term used in a lot of Eastern books. And there is another, and when one starts working on that, there is another aspect that comes also, and that acts as an obstacle, and it's desire, which is also triggered by memory. Desire, anger, torpor, agitation, etc. These are all, and doubt. Doubt is also something, and that's very interesting, because doubt is it worth it, or really, are we a spiritual nature? Do we have a spiritual nature? What are we, etc. And here, the positive thoughts, the proper awareness and the faith, not a blind faith, but an intelligent awareness that we are not just this body, we're not just this desire, but we are something more to it, will act as a positive help. And then it is said that this is part of what will develop the proper disposition for enlightenment, because that is the idea behind these schools, because it believes in enlightenment. So let the mind be at rest, and maybe use an image, a statue, a beautiful object, or something that is inspirational, and then the mind can just get attuned to that. And we heard of dharana, which is the first step to meditation, which is concentration. And then it's also spoken of in this school of the Samatha school of post-meditation practices. And we understand that obviously when there are certain restrictions and a certain way of living in this school while practicing the meditation, after the exercise of meditation, one should avoid doing just the opposite of what is said, by becoming angry or getting involved into watching violent movies or whatnot, or going out and just drinking, etc. It's to avoid having new obstacles coming in, but trying to focus one's life post-meditation into that the same field of thought, which would, in the theosophical terms, in Judge's, William Corn Judge's words, would be called the lifelong meditation. That is, try to focus on something that is spiritual and live and apply this calmness which we are seeking for during the meditation. And now we move into the second part, which is the Vipassana, as was said. And here we see that this has become also very, very popular in a lot of places. And in India, the Vipassana meditation was even practiced in prisons. Why? Because it brings a certain awareness, and in some, of course, this also depends on the different schools and who has done this. In some of these prisons, when this was proposed to the people, they found that after a few months of exercise and work, they found a tremendous change in their awareness, and because the people's insight was had really focused on something that was more than just having to struggle in life and feeling resentment, etc. This was a very positive outcome. But we'll speak about, but this depends, of course, on each person. And this also goes with the idea that it shouldn't be something that blames a person or that cultivates the feeling of shame or of guilt, as some people expect some spiritual exercise to develop, because that's the danger. One should not cultivate guilt, because that is something negative, but to become aware maybe of mistakes, and then to have that confidence in one's nature that one can move on and change the course of life. That was something very interesting. So it is self-transformation through self-observation. And this was done in a very specific method. So we'll move out of just that example of with the prisoners, but just show that this is also part of the development of insight through the Vipassana method. It reveals truth on the impermanence, understands the emptiness of voidness. And there, of course, it depends on the way it is taught. The method is interesting, but it shows what is permanent and what is impermanent, which is very Buddhistic. It's part of the preliminary steps of Buddhism. And there are 3 steps that are worth mentioning. One is the moral code, and that reminds us of what was said in the aphorism. It's not very far from what was said in this on page 29, the aphorism 29. That is, abstain from coveting, abstain from stealing, a certain continence, and also be honest. That is, have this harmony, shila, which is spoken of. That is harmony between a word, one's thought, what comes out, the word, and the act, etc. And then the mastery of the mind and goodwill. And here we move on to metta bhavana, the good, loving kindness to all. So there are also 18 areas of concentration about the impermanence, about suffering, about impersonality, aversion, detachment, decline, etc. We won't enumerate all 18, but this just shows that in everything we do, we'll try to seek what is more permanent rather than just be caught up by what is impermanent. If we look at a flower, we can admire its beauty, but let's go into something else, go deeper into it, because if we just look at the outside, we know that the flowers will fade away and they'll disappear. We'll look at the flower as a beauty that nature has given or that provides constantly. We'll admire the beauty and the color, etc., but we will not get disappointed or unhappy if we lose the flower, because that's the natural course of things. So this is also a way of integrating what is permanent, what is impermanent. And it's same for in our relations with human beings. We'll understand that people can disappear, that the body is something that is impermanent, but there's something more to the body or to the person, which is the soul, which is permanent. So these are also interesting aspects. And then the Metta Bhavana, which comes from Maitri, because Metta is this Pali word for friendship, and Maitri. And here we have something that is very interesting too, which corresponds to, of course, this idea of universal brotherhood, which is cultivating positive emotions as a way to support our exercise of meditation. And here it said Maitri, the loving kindness. The steps are given in some of the books. Maitri, loving kindness and friendliness. And then we'll move the area of our friendship wider and wider. The scope will become larger and larger. And then it's spoken of karuna. Karuna is compassion. And then there's mudita, or sympathetic joy for others. That is to say that even if we don't know them, we feel the joy and we share that joy with others, because we break up this idea of separateness with others, and slowly we'll understand the other's true joy. Of course, it's not just joy for after a football match or whatnot, but it could be a true joy for something that is.
So friends, as we've heard from the previous talks, the whole concepts and practices of mindfulness are nothing new. It's just a rediscovery of ancient wisdom, particularly from Buddhism, and the yoga traditions of India, and Platonism, or Neoplatonism. So, what is mindfulness? No one would deny that constant restlessness in body and mind is a very modern affliction. For most of us, most of the time, we are in a constant state of worry, anxiety, nervousness, and unfulfilled desires over one or several things at the same time. Those moments of clarity and lucidity are few and far between. But the aim is, through the ancient practice of mindfulness, to increase and expand those moments and make them the norm rather than the exception. We often speak of the pendulum swing of normal life. The pendulum swing of states of mind, swinging constantly from happiness to sadness, on all points in between, and then back again. The aim is to achieve that fixed state of the pivot, the part which does not swing or move, the central point, the calm center, which does not alter and is not disturbed by outward conditions. We could also call it the state of equanimity, of inner poise and balance, or calmness. And it said that peace and calmness is the gate to the kingdom of heaven. And the light on the path describes the condition of the soul under normal conditions, lives for the life of sensation, as distinguished from that of knowledge. It is vibratory or oscillating, as distinguished from fixed. So again, we have the idea of the pendulum swing. And again, in the voice of the silence, advises us to reach that fixed state, of that point of fixedness or stability, we could call it. Thou hast to reach that fixity of mind in which no breeze, however strong, can waft an earthly thought within. Thus purified, the shrine must of all action, sound, or earthly light be void or empty. Now, of course, this describes perhaps the higher state of meditation, and this mindfulness is a gradual process. We must begin with the basics and build up to meditation, or the highest meditation, samadhi or enlightenment. But only under such conditions of fixedness, of calmness, of tranquility, of inner stability can the voice of the silence speak or be heard. The inner voice which always speaks the truth, the voice of intuition, the voice of the soul. Only then can wisdom and intuition reach the mind. Calmness is the first essential prerequisite. And of course, mindfulness, we could say the goal or the effect of developing mindfulness or disciplining of the mind is the awakening of this wisdom. The Dhammapada puts it very succinctly. Dhammapada, the writings of the Buddha. Wisdom fills not the unsteady mind of the man of ruffled serenity. He is ignorant of the true teaching. Fear there is not for him whose mind is not burning with desires, and which, having risen above likes and dislikes, is serene. He is awakened. Whatever an enemy may do to an enemy, whatever a hater may do to a hater, a wrongly directed mind will do us greater harm. Not a mother, not a father, not my kindred can do much. A well-directed mind does us greater service. So calmness is the first step, really, the absolute prerequisite for any kind of insight or wisdom. The mind must become like the clear lake, tranquil, limpid and serene, before it can reflect the higher mind. And again, referring to the voice of the silence, for the mind is like a mirror. It gathers dust as it reflects. It needs the gentle breezes of soul wisdom to wipe away the dust of our illusions. Seek to blend thy mind and soul. And soul with a capital S in this sense referring to our spiritual soul, the Buddhi principle in us. In the Dhammapada, the practice of mindfulness is equated with vigilance or watchfulness over the functioning of the mind. The Dhammapada speaks of heedlessness or lack of attention, lack of awareness, lack of being conscious of our thoughts and actions. Vigilance is the path to life eternal. Thoughtlessness is the path to death. The reflecting vigilant die not. The heedless are already dead. By endeavour, by vigilance, by discipline and self-control, let the wise man make for himself an island which no flood can overwhelm. We could say that this heedlessness is the opposite of mindfulness. The word heed, is an old form of the word head. So we could have this image of being headless. In other words, with no governance over our actions, of being out of control. Heedless also in the sense of a lack of awareness, of not paying attention, of being absent-mindedness, or daydreaming, of not being in the here and now, of dwelling in the past, or of expectations in the future. But by doing so, we miss out the most important, which is this present moment, called by some the power of now, because the present is really all we have, the only thing we can have any control over. The past, is gone. The future has not yet appeared. And there's an old saying in English, keep your head when all around you are losing theirs. Now, this implies a degree of detachment for objectivity, alertness, perceptiveness, focus and concentration, as well as the practice of patience and composure. All these are higher soul qualities, you could say, or spiritual qualities. A fellow student has coined the term, and I think it's a very appropriate term, that of choiceless awareness. This also involves doing everything we do consciously, from the small and mundane, everyday things to the big things, to the urgent things, the important things in life. There's no place for absent-mindedness or daydreaming. This is part of what is known as the skill in action, or true yoga, Raja Yoga, developing skill in action. Much of our thinking and behavior is habitual, mechanical and even automatic. We must become conscious of our bad habits, our negative states of mind, and begin to turn them around. And this ties in with what was mentioned about being in constant self-observation, particularly of one's mental states, and particularly if they are negative, such as anger or irritation, restlessness, worry and doubt, and so on. We must turn these around to their opposites, encourage the opposite quality in us. Set up a contrary or a counter center of gravity, of focus. And there is an axiom which is actually a paraphrase of the words of the Buddha. Sow a thought, reap an act. Sow an act, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. Sow a character, reap a destiny. So we have the whole chain there of life, you could say, of cause and effect, beginning with the thought, the habitual thoughts, the seed thoughts, which we hold habitually, we feed daily, which make up what was described as this line of life's meditation. What is your state of mind most of the day, or most of your life? In fact, is it a good state? Is it a positive one, or is it a chaotic one, only you can know and address. Because much of life today has become mechanical. People act automatically, even unconsciously. They follow the same pattern each day, like the record going round. We repeat the same patterns because we don't need to think. It carries us along, and but then the danger is we lose ourselves. We lose control, really, over our own nature. Thoughts have power. They attract corresponding elementals which coalesce with strongly held thoughts and ideas and reinforce them. This is a law of nature, and even the highest masters are not exempt from this law. All we can do is to ensure that we have thoughts of good quality, and like the masters, learn to people our current in space with entities powerful for good alone. So it said anyone on the spiritual path, particularly the more advanced one is, we have a responsibility to leave good impressions on the ether and good vibrations on the earth wherever we go. So that is quite a responsibility, really. That is taking true mindfulness, in a sense, taking responsibility for all of one's principles, particularly the mind, which is, in a sense, the most powerful. And it is powerful. Thoughts, it said, thoughts are actions. In fact, and there are every thought precedes an action. It sets up a chain of cause and effect. A degree of self-control, restraint is essential to knowing exactly when and how to act, or not to act, as the case may be, accordingly. This is all part of skill in action or through yoga. And quoting from the 18th century Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant, he speaks of the power of judgment or discrimination, discernment, free from concepts and sensations, is the higher reason, or we could say the higher manas, the buddhi manas, a necessary and practical faculty for man. Patanjali, in his aphorisms, and we touched on this earlier, speaks of the three modifications of the mind which are normally operate under normal conditions, namely memory, emotions, and the senses, which included the desires. So, the three practices of mindfulness necessary to regulate these are attention, concentration, and contemplation. These are the skills needed to train the mind, in a sense, to learn to skillfully use this instrument. And it is an instrument, a tool, used by the soul, the inner man. Although man is defined as the thinker, we are essentially soul beings. And we use the mind and the body as instruments while we are incarnated on the earth. The mind is still only an instrument of the soul, which, like the body, is a useful tool which needs to be disciplined and used skillfully in order to achieve worthwhile things. Otherwise, they will follow their own inherent natural tendencies. The mind is the key, for it controls the body. It is a powerful tool, and we have the saying, mind over matter. We know that's true, because we've all had experience of that. But the mind itself must be guided by the higher self, the Buddhimanas, or the enlightened consciousness. This is part of Raja Yoga, which is defined as the exercise, regulation, and concentration of thought, of developing psychic and spiritual powers and union with one's higher self. Plato put it very succinctly in his depiction of the union of psyche and nous, and this is very similar to the previous quote we had from Plato regarding the ardent turning of the soul to the divine. The same idea. He speaks of the soul, which includes the mind. Soul is psyche, and in most languages the soul is a feminine principle. When she allies herself to nous, or the spirit, she does everything aright and felicitously. The case is otherwise. When she attaches herself to anoia, or ignorance, anoia literally without the nous, or separation from spirit. We spoke of the sin of separation before, separation with our own inner divine nature, our own spirit, our own higher self, in fact. Going back to Buddhism, we have been given 8 golden keys to mindfulness. This is known as the Eightfold Noble Path. These are practical methods which, if practiced, bring about well-being and harmony by changing our internal attitude and consequently our external circumstances and conditions. The first one is right view of oneself and the world, a view that is unprejudiced, unbiased and unconditioned. Second, right thinking, thinking that does no harm to anyone, yourself or others, as well as to all non-human species. The third, right speech. Again, speech is a powerful tool which must be brought under control and discipline. It is a gift, in fact, a gift of the gods, we could say. Right thinking leads to right speech, which should be gentle and harmless. Speak the truth if you must, but do it gently. The fourth is right action. Is it a necessary action? Will it lead to well-being? Be mindful of your actions. Make sure they lead to peace and harmony. The fifth is right livelihood, or right... we'll conclude there. Thank you. I'll remain here for a question and answer session.
Quite
So
running
now
out.
we'll take questions, open questions. Just raise your hand, and we also invite comments, brief comments, if you feel they relate to what we just heard. Yes?
Can we just go back to the concept of choiceless awareness?
Yes?
Please?
It was, that term was coined by a colleague of ours who is not here today, but I thought...
It's actually a Krishnamurtian term.
Yes, isn't it Krishnamurti?
Is it? Oh,
yeah.
Yes, but and he was quite a teacher in his own right. He started as a theosophist, but anyway, think about it. What does it mean exactly? Yes, it means certainly a sense of detachment, self-observation, not being involved, or we could say being dispassionate. In whatever situation, circumstance you find yourself in, it may be pleasurable, it may be painful, it may be something in between, boring or uninteresting. But whatever it is, you are not identified with it. We could say simply, it's not identifying with certainly not in the extremes of emotion, but remaining, keeping that fixity, that inner fixity, that equanimity, the same idea, really. Yes?
Yes, please could you repeat the seventh principle to enlightenment? You said seven?
The 7 elements of enlightenment. I'm not sure. Well, they are really a summary, really, of a lot of the things that have been mentioned here today. I think we had it in a meeting not that long ago on Buddhism, I think it was. The first, of course, was...
What was the 7th?
Sorry, the 7th, all 7.
The last one.
The last one was equanimity. Equanimity.
Okay, thank you.
So, yes, that inner fixity of that inner poise, tranquility, balance, that state of balance, really. Body, mind, and soul.
May I add something to what you were saying, Gita, and a question Matthew asked earlier about the motive? Sorry, did you have a question?
No.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, Andrew. So, regarding the motive, I mean, can we say a little bit about how meditation could appeal to a philanthropist, and perhaps how subduing the lower nature ultimately becomes an obvious choice, and as you were saying, how we're all connected.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the ideals that are given in the voice of the silence is that of compassion applied to this idea of meditation, because what is given as a teaching is that we just spoke of the true nature of being, which is bliss. It's ananda, which means happiness, the joy. When one discovers one's nature, there is a very natural bliss that accompanies this. And the idea that is given in Buddhist and Hindu teachings, or that this communion with oneself is accompanied by this experience, which is enlightenment and nirvana. And great teachers like Krishna or Buddha have relinquished this idea of contemplation and samadhi to retain the intelligence and the knowledge that is conferred by this state of consciousness, but to remain in the context of humanity, to keep coming back and help humanity. So that is the highest, I would say, motivation, the generosity. And it said, why? Because it said, now bend thy head and listen well, O Bodhisattva. Compassion, that's karuna, speaks and said, can there be bliss when all that lives must suffer? Shall thou be saved and hear the whole world cry? Now that thou hast heard that which was said, thou shalt attain the 7th step and cross the gate of final knowledge, but only to wed woe. Remain unselfish till the endless end. Thou art enlightened, choose thy way. So it's really a personal choice. And so the preparation of this comes from the cultivation of generosity, of awareness of what goes on, and also of this non-separateness, and progressively becoming mindful of the reality of compassion.
Yes.
That's an interesting question. I mean, what makes one man a philanthropist and another man indifferent? And in the 19th century Britain, we had several very well-known philanthropists, and none of them had any connection with Buddhism or theosophy or any of these what we've been studying here today. And yet they displayed these qualities of great compassion for the suffering of particularly the poor, of which there were a huge class in this society, and despite being probably the wealthiest nation on earth at the time.
So can we say that the lower nature is perhaps the cause of all the suffering? Our own lower natures?
No, but the question is, what will make that a philanthropist identify with the suffering of others and want to work to help them, to go beyond his own little life, his own ego.
Once we realise that we're all connected. Me and Will was speaking about one of our favourite quotes from The Key to Theosophy this morning, and where Blavatsky says essentially we're all one and the same essence. Therefore, the action of one man or one nation affects the action of all other men in all other nations. So I suppose it's realizing that whether we like it or not, we are all connected. And I suppose that's when the real philanthropist makes the effort to subdue the lower nature.
But this is to be done with due respect to karma. That is the law of action and reaction, of harmony, unity. But it's also not interfering in other people's lives against their choice, because humanity is is suffering, it's true, but one can't go and just, it's not vicarious atonement or just having faith in some, spiritual truth that will help the others. It's a personal choice. Each individual has to.
Yeah. One last question before we conclude.
Well, the philanthropist may not have any conscious thought or understanding or agreement with the idea that all life is one. But if he or she is a real philanthropist who's actually doing their acts from a spirit of philanthropy rather than wanting to be seen, then presumably in some previous lifetime, in some way, they've cultivated this broad selflessness and generosity, which majority of us don't have yet. Or maybe if we had enough money to demonstrate it, we would have it.
Well,
it's interesting that a lot of those Victorian philanthropists, they made their fortune already. They were very well off, or they had a certain influence in society. And what they did, a lot of them working in education or in the area of work, they helped those disadvantaged people to help themselves. They didn't just dole out money or goods, they actually helped them to improve their lives themselves, and just gave them the opportunity for education or to develop skills and so on. So
I think a lot of the northern industrialists,
that's right.
It was the community.
Yeah.
It was the order that helped them really set up the community from health, education.
That's why some of them even built model villages,
Yeah,
to house their workers, so they would be have a better quality of life.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you, panel.
Thank
Now
you.
to conclude with
Thank you. Don't worry, we'll just take 5 minutes to wrap up.
One thing we needed to say was that the new program is out. So for the next 3 months, so do get hold of a copy if you haven't got it so far. we should also say that tomorrow we have a meeting on the topic of living peacefully, living consciously, dying peacefully. So that's tomorrow at 7 here, and the format will be 2 short talks, very short talks, followed by about an hour of question and answers. So if you're interested, do come along. And as all the activities of this lodge, they're all free of charge. So we hope to see you there. And before concluding, we just wanted to read a couple of very short quotes, which are in the helpful hints there. So you can have a look later on as well. But the first one was actually on a practical side. It said, by setting aside a particular time for meditation, a habit is formed, and as the time comes round, the mind will, after a while, become trained, so that meditation at a particular time will become natural. Hence, it will be well for you to keep for the same hour as far as possible. That was just a little practical tip, which might make a difference. And the second quote is from H.P. Blavatsky in The Key to Theosophy. It said, real ecstasy was defined by Plotinus as the liberation of the mind from its finite consciousness, becoming one and identified with the infinite. This is the highest condition, but not one of permanent duration, and it is only reached only by the very few. It is indeed identical with that state which is known in India as samadhi. The latter is practiced by the yogis who facilitate it physically by the greatest abstinence in food and drink, and mentally by an incessant endeavour to purify and elevate the mind. So we thought that was quite a good summary. And yes, in these relatively turbulent times, and a little bit separative times we live in and we're going through recently as well, we feel that meditation and in particular the idea of realizing the unity of life is a very powerful tool that we should use not just for ourselves but also to try and raise the consciousness of and help people around us. And in Theosophy it said, try and act for and as the self of all. And I guess that's something we'd like to finish on. Thank everyone for your attendance. And we hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.